Ah, Sparta and Athens. You've heard the names. They were two of the biggest players in ancient Greece. They spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, but man, they could not have been more different. Today we're going to dive into one of history's all-time greatest rivalries and see what it tells us about how powerful a simple idea can be.
So you have to wonder, right? How does that even happen? You've got two neighbors, basically sharing a backyard, and one becomes this legendary military state, while the other becomes the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. It's a fascinating story. Let's get into it.
Okay, so to really get their rivalry, we have to imagine stepping into two completely different worlds. Because even though they were both Greek, their ideas about the right way to live, to run a city, to be a person, they were polar opposites.
And here's a simple way to think about it. Society, that's the how. It's the rules, the systems, how people live together day to day. But culture, that's the why. It's what a group of people believes is most important. For Sparta and Athens, that why was completely different, and it changed everything.
First up, let's talk about Sparta. This place had one single, laser-focused purpose: to build the most feared army on the planet. And this wasn't just for show. See, Sparta was built on the backs of a huge population of enslaved people called Helots, and the Spartans lived in constant fear of a massive revolt. So their entire society, top to bottom, was designed for one thing: control through military power.
7. Just look at that number. For a boy in Sparta, this was everything. This was the age his life stopped being his own. At just 7 years old, he was turned over to the state to be shaped into a weapon. Can you even imagine that?
At 7, he'd kiss his family goodbye and enter the Agoj, this notoriously brutal state training program. He'd live in a barracks with other kids, and his life would just become this constant, punishing test of strength, toughness, and absolute, unquestioning obedience. This wasn't school, it was a factory for soldiers.
In a system like this, your individual hopes and dreams, they didn't matter. The goal was to erase all that and make you a perfect, interchangeable part of the Spartan war machine. You weren't an individual anymore, you were a piece of the flanks. You were a gear in a city that was basically one giant army.
You've probably heard this famous line. It was something Spartan mothers would actually say to their sons before a battle. And it meant exactly what it sounds like. Come back victorious with your shield, or come back dead, carried on it. Surrender? Not an option. That was the pressure these guys lived under every single day.
Now, all this military obsession led to something really surprising: the role of Spartan women. I mean, unlike anywhere else in Greece, they were educated and even got physical training. And you might ask why? Well, the Spartan logic was ice cold and simple. Strong women have strong babies, and strong babies grow up to be strong soldiers. So their freedom, their respected status, it was all part of the military plan.
Okay, now let's do a complete 180 and jump over to Athens. If Sparta was a lockdown army base, Athens was like this buzzing, wide-open marketplace of ideas. As they got wealthy from trade, a whole new kind of citizen popped up: artists, philosophers, merchants, and they all wanted a say in how things were run. This energy turned the city into a hub for art, new ideas, and this wild new experiment they called democracy.
So, an Athenian boy's education? Totally different. He was learning to read and write, sure, but also music and philosophy. The whole point wasn't just to churn out a soldier, but to create a well-rounded, thinking person who could be a part of public life. Yeah, they had to do military service, but it wasn't their entire reason for being.
And that, right there, is the Athenian ideal in a nutshell. A man's worth was measured by his mind, by his ability to argue a point in the assembly, to cast an informed vote, to think for himself. The perfect citizen was someone who was educated, engaged, and an active part of his own government.
But, and this is a huge but, here's the massive paradox of Athens. In this city that was celebrating the individual citizen, half the people there weren't considered citizens at all. For an Athenian woman, all that amazing democracy and philosophy happening outside her front door might as well have been on the moon. Her world was the home, her job was to run the household, and she was completely invisible in public life.
All right, now that we've visited their two very different worlds, let's put them head to head. This is when you really see just how far apart they were.
Just look at the difference in the roles of women. In Sparta, a woman's strength was seen as a resource for the state. She was respected, she had a public role. In Athens, she was kept at home, completely cut off from the civic life her husband was supposed to be a master of. Two different planets.
This table really breaks it all down. These aren't just words, you know? These are the building blocks, the DNA of each city. For Sparta, it's all about strength, discipline, obedience, things that serve the group, the state. For Athens,
It's education, democracy, creativity, all things that empower the individual. Every single difference we've talked about really comes from this one basic split.
Which brings us to the big idea here. The epic rivalry between Sparta and Athens wasn't just about who had the bigger army. It was a clash of their most fundamental values.
You can think of values as the invisible blueprint for a society. They decide everything, from how you raise your kids to what you're willing to fight and die for. Sparta and Athens were just working from two totally different blueprints.
When you boil it all down, this is what you get. Sparta was all about the collective. The state, the group, that was all that mattered. Athens, though, was one of history's first great attempts at celebrating the power and potential of the individual.
And that kind of leaves us with one last question to think about. The war between Sparta and Athens is long over, but that tension between their core ideas, the power of the group versus the freedom of the individual, the need for security versus the need for creativity, that's still with us. So, when you look around at our world today, what values do you see shaping it?